Yes. Yes. Thank you very much for letting me present my research today. I really appreciated the Lucy's presentation as well, which spoke to the real ambivalence that many of these artists experience when participating in these national exhibitions. Okay. So in the archives of the Israeli art exhibition held at Amsterdam Stedelijk Museum in 1955, one photograph stands out. A black and white image of an Israeli flag stationed at the museum's entrance on a snowy winter day. When I first saw this photograph at the museum archive, I asked the archivist if raising the flag of a foreign nation was common practice at the Stedelijk during these years. The immediate post-war era was, after all, a moment of heightened optimism over the potential of cultural diplomacy to lead the world to international peace. After some digging, we learned that neither before nor since has the flag of another nation flown outside the museum. So what made this 1955 presentation of Israeli art unique as an overt expression of national recognition? This presentation examines how this state-sponsored traveling exhibition translated Israeli art to audiences across Western Europe, and how these audiences projected their own ideas about modernism and nationalism onto the work on view. As it traveled across Europe, the Israeli art exhibition was seen through a Europe in transition, from the ramping up of Cold War ideological clashes to the repressed memory of the Holocaust 10 years after the end of World War II. And as it circulated across Europe, the exhibition produced a new concept of Israeli art that would ultimately flatten the aesthetic and political differences of the artwork on view in the service of a homogeneous concept of Zionism aligned with European discourses of modernism. In its original form, the exhibition was the Israeli contribution to the 27th Venice Biennale before it traveled to Rome, Amsterdam, and Brussels. The Israel Pavilion had opened only 2 years earlier, designed by Zev Rector to evoke the whitewashed modernist concrete structures, later somewhat misleadingly dubbed Tel Aviv Bauhaus. The Israel Pavilion was both the first pavilion to be built at the Biennale after World War II and the first extra-European nation to do so, in the words of the Biennale Secretary General, Rodolfo Pellicchini. The outsized importance of this modest white cube was emphasized by a senior official in Israel's Ministry of Education and Culture, who, upon the completion of the building, emphasized the new state's commitment to the project, saying, quote, "In a newly founded state, which without exaggeration may be said to be struggling for its very primary essentials, problems of culture are naturally postponed and considered less pressing than acute material needs. Nevertheless, our decision to undertake the building of an Israeli pavilion in Venice was made despite the many predicted and unpredicted difficulties which a new state faces in projects of this nature." After a much needed jolt to the Israeli economy in the form of a West German Holocaust reparations agreement, which took effect in 1953, the state would ramp up its existing cultural diplomacy projects, which resulted in growing the ambitions of the Venetian presentation into a touring exhibition crossing 3 countries. Israeli art was curated by Eugene Kolb, the influential director of the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. The exhibition included 9 intergenerational artists working in a range of styles and media, from drawing to painting to sculpture. Chaim Attar, for example, was represented by a series of portraits of his fellow kibbutz members at Ein Harod, which were worked up in a thickly expressive impasto of richly colored oil paint on canvas. Other work signaled more fervent nationalist sentiment arising in the aftermath of 1948, when the State of Israel was declared during the First Arab-Israeli War. Moshe Tamir's fresco, Amnon Wounded, a depiction of a bandaged wounded soldier, was produced during the War of 1948, when, if the artist is to be believed, it was made, quote, in between raids and warding off tanks with Molotov cocktails, end quote. Kolb, like other pavilion curators, had been asked by the Biennale authorities to select their national contributions to the international surrealist movement. Part of the Biennale's effort since its post-war reopening in 1948 to recover those artistic traditions deemed degenerate under fascist Europe, surrealism was a leitmotif of the Biennale as a whole, as well as abstraction, as this Italian newspaper article attests. Kolb's selection, however, revealed the notable lack of a surrealist tradition in Israel, and instead highlighted practices largely concerned with capturing social and political life, which were, broadly speaking, allied with realism associated in particular with the kibbutz movements. After Venice, the exhibition traveled to Rome, where Mordechai Ardon's painting Cherbet Hisse was ultimately acquired and displayed alongside a painting of lit and extinguished candles evoking the Holocaust, which won a special UNESCO prize at the Biennale. A press clipping from the Jerusalem Post describes Cherbet Hisse as a Jerusalem hills or a Judean hills landscape. This description, however, is not entirely accurate. Rather, it is a painting that evokes S. Yitzhar's 1949 short novel, Cherbet Hisse. The story of one day told through the eyes of an unnamed Israeli soldier at the end of the First Arab-Israeli War, which Israelis call the War of Independence and Palestinians call the Nakba, the disaster that saw the expulsion of an estimated 750,000 Palestinians from what became the State of Israel. From sunrise to sunset, the soldier narrates a mission to drive out the Palestinian inhabitants of the fictional village of Cherbet Hisse, to destroy their homes and to deliver the remaining population to the Jordanian side of the recently established border. Expecting to be met by armed fighters, the soldiers instead find those who were left behind in the chaos of war: women, children, the elderly, and the disabled. While the narrator feels pangs of conscience, he ultimately completes his mission. Thus, in the story, his conquering of the other leads the protagonist not to unification with his own people or nation, but to a sense of alienation within himself. The book became subject to heated national conversation in Israel, as critics debated the image of Israeli society that was presented and more broadly questioned how Israel could maintain its humanity if it refused to acknowledge the humanity of others. Ardon's Cherbet Hisse is a landscape of an abandoned countryside, its dark ground punctuated by gray hillside and multi-directional scores of energetic red paint. Its bright yellow sky contains an orange double ring of a sun, a temporal marker of the painting and the novel. The sun rises as the army enters the village and sets as the soldier reflects on the events that occurred over the day. The novel was only translated into Italian recently, within the last 10 years. Thus, the significance of the painting's title was likely lost to the public. The accompanying exhibition catalog in Rome did not mention the painting's meaning. Instead, the text proudly proclaimed Zionism's forward march of progress, declaring, quote, "In Israel, no one ever asks where he comes from, but in which direction he goes." And as the exhibition traveled to Amsterdam and Brussels, reviews increasingly described it as an exhibition of Israeli abstraction, moving from the surrealism of the Italian presentation to the abstraction of the Northern Europe presentation. In fairness, in Amsterdam, the exhibition was boosted with Israeli gestural abstraction by Josef Zaritsky, a stalwart of the Israeli art scene who at the time was living in Paris. Zariski's signature blocky swaths of paint were shown in a room opposite the young artist Naftali Bezem, who contributed 5 drawings, 2 landscapes, a ma'abara, or a refugee absorption camp, which were mainly for Jewish immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa to Israel. These were paired with a drawing of a depopulated Palestinian village. His other drawings were portraits, one of which, woman cleaning the floor, depicts a Jewish Yemenite woman named Shoshana, whom Bezem used as a model several times. In this drawing, Shoshana's face is mostly concealed as she bends toward a bucket. The curve of her stooped body and sturdy hands and feet almost threaten to overtake the paper on which Bezem has drawn, highlighting the physicality of Shoshana's labor. Bezem's drawing foregrounds an individual who was triply marginalized in Israel at the time. As a woman, as a day laborer, and as a person of Yemenite origin. In Amsterdam, however, the subject of Bezem's work was sidestepped, and he was instead extolled for his skills as a draftsman. This emphasis on form over content and reception of the exhibition was a common thread across reviews, where Zionism's seeming forward march of progress at some point came to align with the purported goals of abstract modern art. Yet critics also determined the sources of this Israeli abstraction were fundamentally different from that of Europe. For example, one article published in De Volkskrant writes that, quote, Israeli art is an art in the making. It has, how can it be any other way, a connection with the West and its artistic tradition. It is in its progressive expression truly international, like all art of our time. But later on in the review, the author asserts, the love of symbols, the abstraction, appears totally acceptable and understandable in the artists who come from this culture, that nature is experienced not from its outer form, but mainly in the inner life and that of the Old Testament dislike of creating material pictures, which must in one way or another be in the blood. Such sentiments were echoed in Brussels, where Paul Ferrand, the curator of the Palais des Beaux-Arts, where the exhibition was held, wrote, quote, Israel is modern, that goes without saying. But Israel incarnates and perpetuates the longest, the most moving of traditions, and the biblical accent can be perceived in the inflections of its art. These awkward Belgian and Dutch attempts to ascertain the roots of Israeli art's essential uniqueness or otherness is not just an attempt to situate these artists within a new international art world, but was marked by what was not spoken. That is, the almost absolute failure to acknowledge Europe's painful recent past. That is why these mostly Europe-born and trained artists were now seemingly representing the essence of an old new nation state. The Stedelijk Museum's director, Willem Sandberg's own unimpeachable biography as a Dutch resistance fighter made no difference. During the tour of Israeli art, the Holocaust was taboo. Beyond a vague mention in Ferrand's text to the tragedy and victory of the Jewish people. And I should mention here, both Ardon and Bezem had specifically fled Germany to Palestine in the 1930s, and both had explicitly attributed their experiences as refugees to their artistic practices and their choice of subject matter. An assertion that is at odds with the concept of Israeliness as this future-oriented mentality expressed in the language around the exhibition. So flying the Israeli flag at the Stedelijk was more than a simple expression of goodwill toward a new Jewish state. For the Dutch in particular, hosting Israeli art was an attempt at reconciliation, even if couched in euphemism. The closest acknowledgement came at the opening of the Israeli art exhibition in Amsterdam, when the deputy mayor of the city noted that, quote, Amsterdam, with its Jewish past, has a warm sympathy and intense interest in this work from Israel, end quote. If Amsterdam was the Jewish past, Zionism proclaimed to be its future, its relentlessly forward-looking agenda, clearly a relief for those seeking a reset after the 0 hour. The Israeli art exhibition tells a story of how Europe willfully translated Israeli art in the service of its own ideological struggles and suppression of memory. But the exhibition also reveals the role of modern art in constructing and projecting Israeli nationalism. By the late 50s, the outlook of Israeli art institutions had shifted. The work of abstract artists increasingly advanced, while those looking to explicitly depict political and social realities through figural representation were increasingly deemed outmoded. Between Western Europe and Israel, then, there was a mutual interest in only looking forward and not back. But this meant that the troubled realities of Israel in the present that some of the artists tried to communicate in the Israeli art exhibition could not be seen. Thank you.